I want to move to another topic that affects Americans' ability to compete in a global economy, and that's education. Please describe the key features of what you consider to be the best education system in the world, and tell us your goals and timetable for making U.S. schools among the best. Senator Edwards, 1 minute.
The starting place is to get the children young and get them on the right track, which is why we ought to have universal pre-K for 4-year-olds in America. We also should go younger than that to deal with the nutrition, health needs, child care needs of younger children based on some models that have been developed here in Iowa and also in my state of North Carolina. I think we ought to have a national teaching university where we attract the smartest, brightest young people in America to this university. It's like the Naval Academy, and we pay for their education and they go out to the places in America where we so desperately need them. I think that we ought to give bonus incentive pay to teachers who are willing to go to the most difficult places. We need to radically change No Child Left Behind, and if that doesn't work, we should get rid of it. But there are huge changes that are needed in No Child Left Behind. And we need second chance schools because in so many places in America, we still have 2 public school systems. I mean, I would never have been able to do what I've done in this country had I not had a great public school education. It was the foundation for everything that I've done. And what you see in America is you see very wealthy suburban schools that get everything they need, and then poor rural schools, poor inner city schools that are struggling, having an extraordinarily difficult time. I am committed to doing something to create one school system that works for everybody.
Thank you. Governor Richardson.
Well, I would make education one of the top priorities, if not the top priority, as president. And I would start early. Preschool for every child under 4. You get to kids before you're 4. Full-day kindergarten. That is desperately needed. You talked about a timetable. I would say that within 15 years, America becomes #1 again in science and math in K through 12. We're 29th in the world. I would hire 100,000 new science and math teachers. I would create science and math academies. I would revise and strengthen the high school curriculums with local control. Here's my position on No Child Left Behind. I don't think you can reform it. I'd scrap it. It's got to go. It's a burden on schools. It's an unfunded mandate. It hurts all kinds of kids and achievement. What else would I do? I would recognize that the key to our educational system is a good teacher. And we disregard our teachers. We disrespect them. We don't pay them enough. I'd have a minimum wage starting salary of $40,000. And then finally, I would have art in the schools as a way to stimulate kids being stronger in science and math proficiency. But if we're going to be competitive, if we're going to keep families together, if we're going to be a society that values unity, education is the key.
Governor, I do have to ask a follow-up question, and that is, how should people look at the education in your state and where education ranks in your state and interpret from that what changes you would make in America?
Well, we've made enormous progress in my state. We were 49th in the world in the country in teacher salaries. We're 28th today. Educational achievement has increased. You know, one of the problems with No Child Left Behind in my state is that we have 11% Native Americans. We have 42% Hispanic, very rural. And so it's very hard for that achievement gap to be narrowed. Teacher training has increased in my school. Teacher performance. Testing has dramatically improved. We've reduced the achievement gap. I have to deal with this issue every day, just like Governor Culver.
Thank you.
I've dealt directly with some of these issues that affect our country.
Thank you. Senator Obama?
Well, a lot of good ideas have been mentioned. Early childhood education, that will close the achievement gap that we see, particularly for minority children, because oftentimes they are already behind when they start school. Not just talking about how great teachers are, but giving them more money and more support. Changing No Child Left Behind so that we're not just teaching to a test and crowding out programs like art and music that are so critical. But you asked earlier about sacrifices that I'll ask from the American people. One of the things that I want to do is get parents re-engaged in instilling a sense of excellence in their children. And I've said this all across the country when I talk to parents about education. Government has to fulfill its obligations to fund education. But parents have to do their job too. We've got to turn off the TV set. We've got to put away the video game. And we have to tell our children that education is not a passive activity. It is something that you have to be actively engaged in. If we encourage that kind of attitude and our whole community is reinforcing it, then I have no doubt that we can compete with anybody in the world.
Senator Dodd, 30 seconds, please.
Well, I've been asked probably 1,000 times, what's the single most important issue? It's not a very fair question, I suppose, given the importance of many issues. But the answer I've given 1,000 times is education. It is the key to everything who we are, not only economically, individually, and collectively, but our system of governance depends upon an educated population. And too often, the accident of birth has determined the quality of your education. I want to underscore what Barack just said. I agree with him totally. We've got to begin with parents. Parents are the first teachers. And too often we have 37 million people living in poverty, and 12 million of those children, they don't ever get the right start. I come from a family of teachers. One of my sisters just retired for 41 years teaching in the inner city of Hartford. It is staggering what's happening to these kids. So it's going to take leadership in the country that talks about this not just occasionally, but every single day, the importance of this underlying question as to who we are as a people.
Senator Clinton, you wanted in on that?
I do, because I've worked on behalf of education reform for a very long time, and I know that the President has a certain bully pulpit that can be used on behalf of education to do exactly what Chris and Barack and others have said. I'm privileged, to have a family that supported me in education. My daughter's here today. Obviously, Bill and I were incredibly focused on her education. So the federal government only pays 10% of the costs of public education. Let's use those dollars strategically. Let's do what we've said we were going to do. How about funding special education, which we never have to the extent that we promised, putting a lot of burdens on states and local districts? How about fully funding whatever we ask the local communities to do? So I want to have a very holistic view of this, because if you go into a classroom today, it doesn't look like the 21st century in most instances. It looks very familiar to me, who was last in a classroom decades ago. We've got to bring it in to the 21st century, and I will use both the bully pulpit and legislative and executive efforts to do that.
Senator Edwards, 30 seconds.
Well, I've already talked about education. You asked me about this at the beginning, I think. But what I would add on to that is I think if you think about the period post-high school, post-K through 12, post-early childhood education, there's such enormous work to do to make sure the kids get to go to college, first of all. What I've suggested is that any young person in America who's willing to work when they're in college, we pay for their tuition and books at a state university or community college. And I also want us to think in a bigger way, in a more visionary way, about what we do over the long term to create an infrastructure that allows America's workforce, when they're 30, 35, 40, 45, to continue to be the best educated, most innovative workforce on the planet. This is something America needs.
I mistook you for raising your hand again, so that was extra time. Senator Biden?
Well, the reason my wife's not here today is she's teaching. She's been teaching, and she teaches full-time, and she has a doctorate in education. And but you don't need a doctorate in education to know there's 4 things everybody out there knows we have to do. Every parent knows it intuitively. Got to start kids at school earlier. You got to put them in smaller classes. The smaller the class, the better the outcome. You got to, in order to do that, you need 100,000 more teachers. But you got to pay teachers in this economy. You have 6 out of 10 kids going into teaching leaving within 5 years because the pay is not competitive. And lastly, you got to provide access to college, and that costs money. And we can easily pay for it. It's about our priorities.